One of the lawmakers who you just saw, he co-chaired today's hearing. He is Albany Assemblyman Jack McEneny. Assemblyman, it's good to see you.
Good to see you,
You
too.
have many years of experience in this particular arena. And you heard the governor and what he said there. And your response to him is what?
Well, what I asked is that the governor would spend more time worrying about how it's done rather than who gets to do it. A bad redistricting by an independent board of reformers is somehow better than a good redistricting done by members of the legislature. So I think there's a prejudgment going on there. My comment, you'll recall, was if the governor wants to veto the work product because it's a bad work product, I respect that. I could support it. And bear in mind that Shelley Silver, myself, 80 members of the Assembly support the governor's independent redistricting. The Senate did not feel that that was appropriate.
Right.
We live with independent powers in this state, thank God. That's our Constitution. And nothing was done on redistricting for the entire session. So it's time for somebody to recognize that it has to start.
We saw Senator Nozzolio in Nick's report talking about time has run out. We have to. Okay. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that. The public hearings have to start. If at some point the governor did come to terms to put together an independent redistricting, these public hearings would only be helpful to that process. The last time there were 12 public hearings, drawing 12 more public hearings. This year it's much more difficult. As Senator Nozzolio pointed out, the Justice Department is calling for a new, probably June primary.
Right.
Which means the whole political calendar is moved up.
But you didn't address that either. The legislature didn't address that. Doesn't the legislature have to act to change the primary date?
Well, we all have to act to do that. The governor has to sign it as well. But the governor was, if you look at all his quotes, the marriage equity, the tax cap, the SUNY tuition, a lot of other things. And I've watched this program many nights where people would list what's left on the table, what's most important.
That wasn't on there.
Redistricting was always
it was not
mentioned at all. It was lucky if it made the bottom of the list.
So do you think that that was a concession to the Senate Republicans who really obviously didn't want to talk about it and, as you noted, didn't actually, even though they signed on to the reform pledge that Ed Koch was pushing, which we'll get to in a minute, then decided later they'd really much rather see a constitutional amendment which wouldn't go into effect until a decade from now?
I can't speak for the Senate Republicans. There's no question the Senate Republicans, all 32 of them, signed a pledge on a bill that they didn't see.
They did.
And were called heroes. And people like myself and others who never signed pledges for bills that aren't in print and didn't do it were called, quote, enemies of the people after 40-some years of public service. So I don't have a lot of respect for former Mayor Koch when he declares people enemies of the people for having the personal integrity not to sign off on bills that they've never seen, and then to call heroes people who, in the end, when they saw the bill, said, we got to do a constitutional amendment on this.
But you also agreed, though, that a constitutional amendment would actually be, in the end, the best way to address this problem?
Well, I think it's the appropriate way to do it, but there are issues in our Constitution which are extremely anti-urban. One is called block on border, which slaughters urban neighborhoods, as people like myself and Steve McLaughlin and Ron Canisteri, our districts are apart by 1 or 2 people, whereas Bob Riley's is off by thousands.
Right.
And the reason is that towns are sacrosanct. Even when they're 81,000, they can never be broken, even when you could take a village out of it. But city neighborhoods, butcher them.
But that's because the people who drew up the Constitution at the time, in their infinite wisdom, were very pro-town.
1894, no, they were anti-city.
I see.
There's a difference. And I think if we had a constitutional amendment, we would want to get that out of there for large towns and preserve urban neighborhoods. Okay,
so when you have people like Dick Dady and Ed Koch saying, we do have time, actually, there is more time for independent redistricting, reform, you have suggested that...
Well, reform is a word that means change.
Right.
Depending on who says it, it's either reform, Sometimes it's just change. Not all change is reform.
True. Okay, now that we've clarified that, though, these public hearings that the LAT4, which is the,
Yes.
help me, the legislative...
It's a legislative task, New York State Legislative Task Force on Demographics and Reapportionment.
Okay, so that's what this shorthand is.
Yes.
You could take all of your work that you've been doing, that you've started,
Yeah.
because there's a timeline here, and hand it over to some independent
There's nothing
entity.
lost. There's no question about it. There's nothing lost. But if we waited because the governor and the Senate failed to come to an agreement, if we waited until September or October or November or, God forbid, January, then we would have a disaster, because the Justice Department, because of men and women's servicemen's voting,
Right.
not being counted. Senator Schumer estimates 20% of all of our people in uniform defending this country, particularly abroad, their absentee ballots don't count.
Right.
They don't get here on
Right.
time. And so putting a minimum of 45 days means that you can't go to August for a primary. Nobody's home. So you have to go all the way back to June, which we haven't seen since 1973 or so.
Do you believe, actually, that this is going to end up going to a special master again? It would be the third time, pretty much.
Well, I believe there'll be a lawsuit, because it wouldn't be a redistricting without a lawsuit.
Well, there already is one, that
But-
prison prison
Yeah.
redistricting count, right?
That's right. Right now, the only numbers we can count are the Senate numbers, or excuse me, the census numbers, whereas the 57,000 people in prison aren't put in there. We have to get moving at some point, and both Senator Nozzolio and myself, who voted the opposite on that issue, have sent a letter and urged the courts, make up your mind, make it up quickly. We'll live with the law, whatever it is, but please don't delay this thing.
And have you received a response from the courts?
No,
Okay.
the courts take
Not
their
surprising.
time.
No,
Yeah.
not surprising. Do you believe, just overarching, that it's possible for politicians, elected officials like yourself, to create a fair redistricting plan?
Do I think it's human beings can create it? Obviously, we can do that. There's no question we can do it if we want to. How do we know that, quote, reformers? What's a reformer? What's an independent? Looking for a person who's totally independent is looking for a person who has no strong religious beliefs, or political beliefs. I don't know what independent means. But can they do a better job? I've seen reformers who have laughed at, I think it's Senator Seward's district, calling it Lincoln's hat, because
Right.
it has a
Right,
big
right, right.
extension.
Yep.
And I'm saying, why do you think that happened? I don't know. Somebody must live up in that area in the town of Webb. I said, no, it's the Herkimer County line. It's been like that almost 200 years. We're supposed to keep counties together. So I think there's a lot of people. I've said, and what I was said in the comment that you saw, is that I hope the governor, and I hope people who espouse reform will concentrate more on how than who, because they get into personalities, not into the rules they'd like to see, keeping communities of interest together, respecting voter rights of minorities. We should be talking about how. And then at the end of the process, if the governor wants to make some recommendations, if he has an independent advisory board of people who actually know what they're doing and understand the state, then it can always be amended.
Well, somehow I don't think that we're done talking about this. So I'm sure that we will be talking to you again soon, actually, but unfortunately we're out of time. So Assemblymember McEneny, thank you very much for being here.